Cortisol is an energy hormone, not a stress hormone. But if you're constantly running on cortisol, it becomes a stressor. It's the reason you're wired but tired. You wake up at 3 a.m. stressed out. You have a low energy throughout the morning and you feel anxious for no particular reason. So today I want to explain what cortisol is, how to tell if your cortisol is fucked, and how to restore your natural cortisol function so you can utilize it for energy, not stress. Now, before we get started, I want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Trevor, and I help scaling entrepreneurs turn health into their unfair advantage without becoming a full-time biohacker so they can perform better, feel better, and ultimately scale their business faster. All right, let's dive right in. What is cortisol? Cortisol's job is to deploy energy to the body, to the muscles, and to the brain. It breaks down tissue and turns it into glucose your body can use. And glucose is your body's preferred energy source. It's what your body runs off of. And cortisol follows a natural rhythm. It's high in the morning to wake you up. Cortisol typically peaks the first couple hours after you wake up, and then it slowly declines throughout the day to ensure that you can get a restful sleep at night and also fall asleep quickly. Cortisol hits its lowest point a couple hours before you fall asleep and a couple hours after you fall asleep. From that point, cortisol starts to slowly rise again. And a couple hours before you normally wake up, you'll see a sharp increase in cortisol. And it does this so it can wake you up and provide energy throughout the morning. Now, cortisol is crucial for the stress response. And its job in this response, again, is to deploy energy to the body with a psychological stressor where you have an important meeting. Cortisol provides energy to your brain so you can be sharp and focused. With a physical stressor where you're bench pressing some heavy weight, cortisol provides energy to your muscles so you can actually lift up that weight. And this isn't inherently bad. It only becomes a problem when your body is constantly in need of cortisol. It constantly needs energy. That is where you start to run into trouble. So how do you know if your cortisol is fucked? Cortisol dysfunction, it doesn't happen overnight. It's months or years of physical or psychological stressors that your body never gets the chance to recover from. It's physical stressors like an autoimmune disease attacking your body, or psychological stressors like you working on your business for 12 hours a day with minimal breaks for years on end. Both of those are stressing your body out. And because your body is constantly stressed, it's going to be releasing high levels of cortisol. And over time, your body adapts to these elevated levels of cortisol and they become your new baseline. And this has negative health consequences and also negative performance consequences. And if you're feeling wired but tired, low energy and anxious, you struggle with your sleep, you have digestive issues, you have trouble concentrating through your deep work sessions, you frequently get sick, these could all be signs that your cortisol could be fucked. Luckily, you do not have to guess if your cortisol is screwed up. You can use something called the Dutch test. This is a dried urine test that gives you a full picture of what's happening with your cortisol. You pee on a piece of paper 4 to 5 times throughout the day, then you mail back that sample and you get your results. You get insights into a whole bunch of markers related to cortisol function, things like how well is your body clearing cortisol? How much total cortisol are you producing? What is your cortisol rhythm like? And this is extremely valuable in figuring out if you have cortisol dysfunction. Now, if you can't access the Dutch test or it's just too expensive, you can also use a saliva test. It's also going to be helpful in figuring out what your cortisol levels are like. It's just not going to be nearly as accurate or comprehensive as something like a Dutch test. The one test I would avoid is a blood test. This measures your cortisol levels at one specific point in the day, but this is not very helpful for us because cortisol changes throughout the day, as we know, based on the cortisol rhythm. All right, how do you restore your natural cortisol function? You have to restore your natural cortisol rhythm. And remember, our cortisol rhythm, it peaks early in the morning, a couple hours after waking, and then it slowly declines throughout the day and it hits its lowest point in the late evening. And that is how a normal cortisol rhythm should work. So we want to support this rhythm. So the first step is going to be to spike our morning cortisol. Now, most people are going to get a natural cortisol spike already, but we want to amplify this morning cortisol spike to one, give us more energy through the morning and through the afternoon, and also to hit a higher peak. Because if we can hit a higher peak, then we're going to have a steeper decline. So when we get into the evening, we're starting at a lower level of cortisol. And this is going to make it easier for us to fall asleep and actually feel ready for our recovery. Now, the goal is not to spike cortisol as high as possible. We don't want to have elevated cortisol for the whole day on hours on end. That is where you run into trouble, and that is where many of you might be at right now. But the goal is to amplify this initial morning spike with 2 or 3 of these practices. So again, we can get that sharp incline and then a slow decline the rest of the day. And the main 2 practices that you're going to be utilizing is bright light in the first hour after waking and a consistent wake time. Now, for getting bright light, there's really 2 practices. Obviously, you can go out and get some sunlight. I'd recommend 5 to 15 minutes on sunny days and bump that up to 20 to 30 minutes on more cloudy days. You can do this while checking your email, looking at your to-do, listening to an audiobook, or you can just enjoy the morning sunlight and go on a walk. Now, the other thing you can do is use a sat lamp. This is a really bright lamp. It emits up to 10,000 lux, and it's enough to spike your cortisol. Now, it's not going to be as effective as morning sunlight, but it gets the job done. So either of those work for getting bright light. And the second practice I want you to prioritize is waking up at roughly the same time every single day. Now, you can be off by 30 minutes on most days and even 60 minutes on some days, but try to stay consistent. And if you are consistent with your wake time, your body is going to spike your morning cortisol at roughly the same time. And you can take advantage of this sharp increase that naturally occurs and amplify it even more for those benefits we talked about. Now, if you're not waking up at the same time, what happens is, for example, let's say you sleep in on the weekends, you might miss that cortisol spike. So instead of getting a sharp natural increase and amplifying it even more, you might miss that spike and actually be amplifying it while it's on the downtrend. And if you do that, you're not going to get as large of a peak. And if you're waking up earlier, to get more work done or whatnot, then your cortisol might not be on that sharp rise already. It might just be slowly going up and just starting to get on the sharp rise. So you're not going to get as high of a peak. So that is why we want to be waking up at around the same time every single day. Now, for the rest of these practices, you can stack or substitute them when needed. So if you wanted to, you could stack one of these practices on top of bright light and waking up at a consistent time, but I wouldn't go more than that, or else you might spike your cortisol too high. And what you can also do is substitute. So if you can't get bright light one morning, or you're not waking up at a consistent time one morning, then you can sub one of these in. And if you sub one of these in, you might get a cortisol spike just as high. But there are some important nuances with these practices. For exercise, if the exercise is consistent, you are going to spike your cortisol if the exercise is novel. So if you exercise at a different time than you normally do, or you change up the intensity, then you're also going to spike your cortisol. For caffeine, if you don't regularly drink caffeine, you will spike your cortisol when you drink it. If you regularly drink caffeine, you won't spike your cortisol, but you're going to increase the duration of that morning cortisol spike. So instead of the morning cortisol spike being like this and that, if you drink caffeine, the cortisol spike might go like this and then wait and then down. So you might be able to extend it, get some more energy in the morning, could be good. Now, the last practice here is cold exposure. And for cold exposure, if it is novel, if you do it once or twice a week and not regularly, you will spike your cortisol. If it is not novel, your body ends up adapting to the cold exposure and you don't see that same cortisol spike. Now, licorice and grapefruit can also extend your morning cortisol spike just like caffeine does, but be careful with these because they are labeled as warnings on blood pressure medication. That is how powerful they are. So if you are taking some blood pressure medication, make sure you talk to your doctor before implementing any of these practices into your regimen. And I also wanted to talk about fasting. I know a lot of you guys fast for your first deep work session, and that fast might be 4 to 6 hours, but this has been shown to blunt your morning cortisol spike. So maybe instead of fasting for 4 to 6 hours, what you can do is after 2 to 3 hours of some deep work, you have a small breakfast or you eat some breakfast. So at least you can still get the benefits of that morning cortisol spike, which is going to give you some great energy. And what you can also do is, if you do still want to do a 4 to 6 hour deep work session, you can just have a small breakfast before, something like a couple eggs and a piece of fruit, and see if that helps with your morning energy. But I avoid doing these long fasts, although it is going to be very individual. Some people can get away with doing these longer fasts because they prioritize their recovery, they're sleeping well, they feel good. But I know most entrepreneurs are not in that case, so you probably should avoid fasting that long in the morning. The next piece to the natural cortisol rhythm is to make sure we have low evening cortisol. Make sure we're getting that nice decline in cortisol in the evening. Cortisol should be at its lowest in the 4 hours before sleep and the first 2 hours after we fall asleep. The lower it is, the better your sleep and recovery will be. And to ensure your cortisol levels are lowest in the evening, firstly, you want to avoid bright lights. Bright lights can spike your cortisol and suppress melatonin. Your body is especially susceptible to cortisol spikes in the evening. So what you want to do is avoid bright lights 1 to 2 hours before bed. If you can avoid it for 4 hours before bed, great. Obviously, not the easiest to do, but if you can, awesome. And in order to avoid bright lights, you want to dim the lights around your house, you want to avoid blue light, and you want to switch to warmer color lights, oranges, reds, rather than blue or violet. Any of these longer wavelength lights are going to be more activating and increase the chance that you spike your cortisol. Next, you want to activate your parasympathetic nervous system. This is going to be great for reducing cortisol. This can be something like breath work, a hot bath, or stretching, something that calms you down, not something that just feels good like watching TV or scrolling on your phone. Next, you can eat some starchy carbs with dinner to help reduce your cortisol levels. Now, this can be a slippery slope if 1, you eat too many carbs, or 2, you're eating carbs on their own. Instead, you want to eat carbs with some fiber, some protein, and you want to make sure that you're not eating too many carbs. If you spike your blood sugar too high, then you actually are going to increase your cortisol because your blood sugar is going to crash too fast. So just keep that in mind. Next, we have supplements like ashwagandha, apigenin, and magnesium L-threonate. These have all been shown to reduce cortisol. Ashwagandha has been the most reliable, but the other 2 supplements have shown some promising data. But before you implement supplements, try these lifestyle interventions first, and then try the supplements if these aren't working. Lastly, I want you to avoid evening workouts. This can spike your cortisol, and avoid doing deep work. This can also spike your cortisol. If you are gonna do work, make sure it's light, and make sure you stop doing that light work 1 to 2 hours before bed so you can give your body a chance to actually recover and actually reduce your evening cortisol. These practices are great for supporting your natural cortisol rhythm, amplifying your morning cortisol spike, and lowering your evening cortisol as much as possible. This is going to give you better energy and better recovery. But most of you probably don't have a natural cortisol rhythm. You've been running on cortisol for years on end. So I want to talk about the different types of cortisol issues you could be facing. High cortisol and low cortisol are both stressors to your body. These are some of the common issues that we see with cortisol dysfunction, and they can progress over time. The first type of cortisol dysfunction is early phase burnout, where you're stressed in the morning and exhausted the rest of the day. If you do a Dutch test, what this will show is you have elevated levels of morning free cortisol, and it's also going to show an exaggerated morning cortisol spike, where your cortisol spikes up really high, it stays there for a while, and then it comes crashing down, hence why you get so exhausted the rest of the day. The solution to early phase burnout is to shorten and shift your morning cortisol spike. To do this, you want to first reduce your cortisol levels. I'd recommend doing some breath work for 15 minutes. Then after that, you want to spike your morning cortisol, but do it lightly. Your levels are already going to be elevated. So view some bright light, great way to spike your morning cortisol. I also want you to avoid drinking caffeine early in the morning, because this is just going to extend the duration of that morning cortisol spike. Instead, I delay caffeine 90 to 120 minutes after you wake up. Also, if you can lower your evening cortisol, that's going to help with your morning cortisol, because if your levels of cortisol are lower going to bed, then you're not going to get as elevated levels in the morning. So try to also lower your evening cortisol. The next cortisol issue is late phase burnout, where you have low energy in the morning and you're stressed out at night. And the Dutch test will show exactly that. You're going to have low levels of free cortisol in the morning and higher levels in the evening. Also, your morning cortisol spike is going to be much lighter compared to a healthy person. The solution to late phase burnout is to lower your evening cortisol. Those last 4 hours before bed, you want to be protecting your cortisol levels. You don't want to do anything that's going to spike your cortisol, and you want to be actively lowering your cortisol with these practices. Now, for the morning, you still want to spike your morning cortisol, but not too much. I'd recommend just viewing bright light and waking up at a consistent time. Don't add on any more practices besides that, because your body's already fatigued. And over time, as you do this, you are going to see that your morning cortisol comes back and you get a better spike and better energy in the morning. The last type of cortisol issue is low cortisol. And if you ignore these first two phases, this is where your body stops producing as much cortisol. And this results in you having low cortisol throughout the entire day and you feel exhausted no matter what you do. Now, if you're experiencing low cortisol, you definitely want to work with a practitioner because it could be a number of reasons for why you're experiencing low cortisol, and the fix is a lot more complex. But regardless of what cortisol issue you have, you always want to test with something like a Dutch test. Do not guess, or you could make things worse. If I told you to spike your morning cortisol and it turns out you have early phase burnout, you are going to make things worse. Instead, test first, see what you have, and then implement a solution. Now, it can take some time to fix your cortisol levels, especially if you've been running on cortisol for years on end, but it's so crucial. It can be the difference between you feeling like you're burning out every single day to you feeling like you're kicking ass in your business and your personal life. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them below. And if you want more personalized help with your cortisol and with your health, feel free to check the first link in the description to learn more about working with me in a one-to-one format. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.